Well, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whatever it is to you. To me, it's the afternoon here, 2025, January, beautiful out, snowing, really in the middle of winter, so beautiful here in Chi-Li, New York, not far from campus. So here I am, another one of our series today. I'll be talking about some interesting topics. I certainly think they're interesting as they relate to our classics, the canon, Shakespeare, fairy tales, contemporary ideas, contemporary thoughts. I really like to thank Captioning Services for everything that they do for us. I depend on them so greatly. And here's my topic for today, my dears. You can see I have that little wonder wheel up there. I love that picture too. Think back about my youth. Feels like a long time ago. Every now and then I think to myself, where'd the time go? The Wonder Wheel. We used to go when I was a kid. We used to go Coney Island Beach. We used to go to the boardwalk. We used to go to Wildwood, New Jersey. We used to take the train, go to Jones Beach. We used to do all these things, all these rite of passage things. Going out to the boardwalk, couple little dollars for a hot dog, a soda. For those of you who don't know what I'm about to talk about, we have this potato thing. It's called a knish, Knish. Delicious. You eat it hot with some mustard in the middle. And so it was like a cultural, regional kind of thing. You could have it for breakfast. It was like, well, a small little take on maybe like a potato patty or a hush patty, one of these potato things you get like at McDonald's, but it's much heavier, it's much more dense. It eats as a breakfast, as a lunch, as a snack. People can share one, sort of like a potato calzone, or maybe, as one of my kids might have said, who wasn't from the region I'm from, a potato bomb. Anyway, why am I mentioning all this? What does it relate to my thoughts as we discuss Shakespeare? Let's talk a little bit today about fairy tales too. I think about the rite of passage. The rite of passage from here's a concept. I've lived this, by the way, on both ends. I've been a parent my whole adult life since I'm 23 years old. And also, of course, I've been a child, right? So I've lived both sides of this discussion. Where does the parent's life stop and the child's life begin as a young adult and or adult? Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare was sort of thinking about these things too. This whole idea of, sexuality, being in love, being in lust. At what point does the child go from the simple love of a parent, etc., maybe another sibling, people that are close to them in the caregiving roles, uh, people that are their peers, their cohorts, and sibling scenarios. Where does the child go from there and how? To making that leap into saying, I'm more of a person that requires more emotional needs to be met, and I'm looking for really my suitor, whether it's a man, a woman, non-binary, whomever, etc. Shakespeare was sort of asking those questions too. At what point do we become our own person from childhood to adult? I think often about the time when I first went away to college. The very first time, I've had few issues and circumstances along the way where I'd gone to school, then took an internship, then went back to school. So I didn't have that continuous 4-year loop. I had some gaps. And so my traditional college experience was a little different. In my traditional college experience, also, I became a mother at 23. And I also was married very, very young while I was in college. I wouldn't recommend that. Anyhow, it's okay. I think to myself, at what point do parents have to have this responsibility where they look at their child who is now living and acting as an adult, assuming all these responsibilities? Shakespeare asked this. I love to talk about Tennessee Williams. Tennessee Williams asked this in his plays. At what point do we recognize that our child is now living as an adult? So often in the land of parenthood, which Shakespeare gives us in so many of his works, this very hard role where you want to be your child's friend, you want to be your child's parent, you want to be the authority person, you want to be a person, safe space, trust, etc. It's hard to have all those roles, okay? And so I think about this often when people are in college. Remember how it is? And you go home for your very first Thanksgiving. You're only gone like 6, 8 weeks from home from, say, August, September to November. But you go home and things feel a little different for people. You know, a parent, caregiver, grandparent, whomever it is that you go home to, they might say, gee, this is different. All of a sudden, my child, the person I'm caregiving, they want to come home 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning. They want to be their own person. They don't want to tell me where they're going. They go in, they go out, they come and go as they please. Some states, if the drinking age is 18, maybe parent, caregiver for the very first time is confronting the fact that their child goes out and drinks. Certainly, when the person is in high school, the parent and or caregiver has more control, or thinks they do anyway, over what the child's going to do. But once the person turns 18 and has demonstrated that they've been out of the house, exactly what happens in the shift of the parent role? We see this shift often in literature because it's such a common thing. We're all trying to figure out relationships. We're all trying to figure out where it is that we are in the schematic of family systems. How many times do we see this in poetry? Do we see this in the sonnets? Do we see this in plays? This constant sort of tugging, because the tugging to some degree is very natural. We have to have that tugging, or people would live at home forever. If there wasn't enough either safety in being able to leave the nest and or conflict that makes you want to leave the nest as soon as possible, people would live at home forever. Literature sort of gives us this opportunity, and film gives us this opportunity to say, what is the best scenario, right? What is the best situation or arrangement for parents and caregivers? At what point do we want to test our own wings? Back to that first Thanksgiving. Very often parents sit together and they say, well, I don't know. Should I ask where he or she is going? Should I ask or tell them what time they should be home? They've had all of this freedom for 6, 7 weeks. I haven't been helicoptering or have the ability to oversee their emotions, their sexuality. I say it like it is. If they're having sexual activity, sleeping with people, sleeping with various people, sleeping with a number of people. Uh, do I allow that in my home? Do I say that this is a boundary that can happen in my home? A very natural conversation experience happens for parents as well as their children. Very often, we see this in different life cycle scenarios that we see in literature. Again, this flexing, this stretching to see where everybody fits in the new schematic. I can speak about myself. I'm comfortable sharing with you as it obviously relates to literature and when we see growth patterns and character development. Remember, art imitates life, life imitates art. It's one and the same. I remember thinking to myself, when here I was a mother, right? 23 years old, a mother. Did I want to be told what to do, what time to come home, all this business, how to raise my kid and everything else? No, I felt that I had spent 9 months pregnant. I was caring for my oldest child at the time, paying all of the bills, etc., making my own decisions. I really didn't want parental influence telling me what to eat, what time to eat. If I were to go home to visit relatives, I didn't want them to tell me what time to come home, who to consort with, what I should be doing with my time, how to raise my child, because there comes a time when the parent or caregiver's life has to be paused in the oversight of their emerging child who is now an adult. Not everybody makes these transitions easily. Again, Tennessee Williams talked about this idea of letting go. At what point does your parent have to let go? At what point do we see characters that want to be fully fledged as an adult, recognized, received as an adult. Let's talk about society, pop culture. You know, in some cultures, in some places, we find often in literature, an adult can mean many things. It can mean uh, a child's first kill, hunting, that may be the mark of early adulthood. Entry to adulthood is when the person is able to go out into the field, certainly 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, early 19th century, go out into the field, kill a pheasant, come back, pluck it, feather it, clean it, strip it, whatever has to be done, and cook it. Maybe that was a mark in adulthood, entry to adulthood. I think to myself, in our culture and customs, other countries are different. The driver's license, right? That the driver's license suggests in some states you can get a driver's license at 15. Do I think that's a great idea? Probably not. But it sort of suggests that you have more adult-like responsibilities, and the parent caregiver isn't always available for that oversight. That the person at 15 can operate a vehicle several thousand tons in weight at times, can drive all kinds of places without curfew, the same rights and responsibilities as somebody 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 on the road, and have that kind of entry into some aspect of adulthood. We look at voting patterns, right? You have to be 18. So is it that we look at a child and we say, now you're 18, you can go off to war, you can purchase cigarettes, you can go vote, in some states you can drink, etc. Access to health care, big discussion in politics. I wonder what Shakespeare would have done with this at his time, you know, to say that somebody 13, 14, 15, 16 can go access particular health care without parents' consent, you know? What would Shakespeare have done to address that? What would he have thought in his time and his place? I think about fairy tales. Very often in fairy tales, which we really haven't embraced this discussion yet, I'll just touch upon it a little because we will come back to it when we're in weeks 5, 6, 7, 8. It will probably make more sense then, but I'll just touch upon it now. In the fairy tale, look at Little Red Riding Hood. She's traipsing through, all these forests. It's like we give her all this responsibility, you know? She's out there trying to negotiate all these large structures, but she's just this little girl that's trying to sort of survive, doesn't even realize, that saying, you don't even know what you don't even know. Little Red Riding Hood has no idea what she's facing in this large landscape that's cavernous, full of woods. Back to Wildwood, Coney Island days at the beach, the Ferris wheel, right? All those good times. Where at first, you go out your first few times, you say, oh, I had such a good time. I hung out with my friends. I had a knish, I had a hot dog, I rode the rides. Then maybe you find a love interest, right? Teenage years, a crush. And then going becomes a little something different, becomes sexual, perhaps, becomes lustful. You look at maybe friends that you've had since childhood. Now you see them as a young man, a young woman, or a young person, right? And we say to ourselves, oh, well, all of a sudden I see this person is very attractive. You know, all of a sudden the rides become a mechanism, uh, a, a way vis-a-vis to get close to the person, to sit on the ride. I remember what it was like to be young, wonderful, where people sit underneath the boardwalk. In childhood, we all want to be on the boardwalk. I mean, in metaphor. That's where the ice cream is, that's where the goodies are, that's where the games are for any students that I might have that are not from our cultural context in the West. They sometimes have arcade games, very inexpensive. You can win stuffed animals, all kinds of little tchotchkes, balloons. You can win all kinds of goldfish, right? And then underneath the boardwalk is sort of a different place, a little bit of romance, a little bit of privacy, similar to the 1950s when automobiles, if you know anything about car history, I like cars, car history, the automobile started to look like safe spaces for women. You know, they were pink and they were plush and they had all kinds of pretty things in them. And from the boys' perspective and conventional setting, conventional relationship at the time, traditional liaison, the idea that the car was sort of like a romantic embodiment, you know, like a bedroom on wheels where a man could feel his independence because it was really thought of that owning a car was more of a man's venture here in our cultural context 50, 60, 70 years ago. And so it was like his bedroom on wheels, you know. He had his freedom. He had freedom to be sexual, to be social, to be away from his parents, to embark on different relationships with people, to find his pleasures. Same for women, to find their pleasures. That women would say, young women, girls would say, oh, and he has a car. This became very important thematically in television, movies, and in all kinds of series and film, television, as well as motion picture. This whole idea, again, this whole struggle that we saw, like again with Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, especially, Little Red Riding Hood. You know, we even see it. I was talking to my husband today. We were talking about Cinderella. She has this struggle in fairy tales. She's dealing with this stepmother, right? The oversight of her, the oversight of these two siblings that she has, these miserable stepsisters. And here, beautiful Cinderella is trying to find herself, trying to find her prince, trying to be received as a young adult, trying to break away from all of these emotional chains, this terrifying bondage that Cinderella finds herself in, the anatomy of a very poor relationship and what it means to be the odd person out, you know, yet testing her inner wisdom, her need to feel emotional and validated and something to somebody. I was thinking of two particular films. I'll wrap up with this thought. I want to talk about two films that really resonated with me that had a lot of these tragic characters, the notion of the tragic protagonist, you know, tragedy, person's youth trying to feel themselves into some aspect of adulthood. There's two films I'll talk about. It's not on the syllabus. I just want to offer it to you because the purpose of these lecture casts, you know, I always say the same thing. I'm not right, I'm not wrong. They're just little observations that I make to solidify my point that the purpose of humanities, the purpose of literature, whether it's in print media and or film, it's okay one way or the other. And of course, in music, gaming, every kind of genre we can think about. It's important to recognize that we keep thematically going back to these same essential questions back again. Where does the child's life begin and the parent or caregiver's life end? The influence of it. So there's this wonderful film about 25 years old. You can see it streaming on television, maybe Netflix, Peacock, something like this. It's called The Yards. Yards. It's about a young man, and he had done some prison time for things that I would call youthful offender, you know, stole a car, big pain in the ass, right? I mean, certainly not anything really horrible like a serial killer, but stole a car, you know, menace to society, all kinds of these related activities. We see a lot of that today. And he comes out of prison, finds himself back with his old neighborhood, back with his mother. His mother is trying to figure out how to receive him as an adult. She sort of left him as a boy, 18, 19, 20 years old. And he left 18, 19, 20, around that age, and came back really a grown man, you know, from a prison situation. We see this often with men and women in corrections that, and remember I had mentioned to you before, I wound up with a career in corrections and criminal justice as well. We see very often people leave as children and they come back as adults and the parents sit in the room, caregiver sits in the room and say, Who the hell is this person? I don't recognize this person. I recognize the child that I said goodbye to. I don't recognize this new adult, this sexual adult, this adult with opinions, this adult that no longer likes my cooking, etc. When did this happen? We see this often in film. There's this marvelous classic film your grandparents would especially remember. It was called The Best Years of Our Lives. The film was really an honest film, all about fictional piece, but it had enough historical fiction and relevance that anybody could relate at the time. World War II, all these soldiers were coming back. They left as boys, 18, 19, 20, and they came back as men. They came back with the adult experience, death, destruction, sadness, longing to be home, isolation, terrible aspects of fear, PTSD. They weren't the same people when they came back as when they left. Another film I can think about, Deer Hunter, people that went off to Vietnam and terrible things that happened to them and how their lives and who it was that they perceived themselves, just like Hamlet, just like Romeo and Juliet, Red Riding Hood, Cinderella, their self-actualization, their self-perception gets challenged and changed by the circumstances that are around them. You go into a situation with one aspect of self, two aspects of self, you leave a completely different person. It's how I feel about childbirth. And I say this for men and for women, that you go into the delivery room regardless of your gender or affiliative gender. And once you become a parent within minutes of delivery, you're a completely different person. Whether you agree or you don't, it just is. You're a different person. You're now thinking for somebody else. There's this, so back to the yards, there's this one point where the mother is just so confused with this son she has, and she says to him, I don't know where we went wrong. I don't know how everything got like this. She said, when you were young, I'm paraphrasing. She said, when you were young, I used to look at other men on the subway and I would say, oh, look how dressed up they are in these suits and they're going off to business. And I thought that would be you. I thought how handsome he would be going off in a suit. So for her, she's saying to her son that the rite of passage for him would have been taking this subway system, going into the world of work, dressing as a man, dressing as a successful man, what her theory was of a successful man, and being part of that sociological sphere. Somebody who's successful, her image of successful. The end of the film, he makes some horrible mistakes post-incarcerated, and he winds up having to go through some legal situations, which is very uncomfortable. And at the very end, it really captures the audience. And at the very end, we see him on the subway and we see him dressed in a suit because he's going to a legal situation. So he wanted to be the best in presentation for himself, self-actualizing. And we hear his mother's words in our mind as the audience. I just had this fantasy that I would see you on the train dressed in a suit and you would be so successful. So I look at these scenarios about parenting, parentage, being a child, being an adult, when to let go of a child, realizing child's desires, sexual, social, emotional, etc. Another wonderful film, sometime when you have time to enjoy yourselves. There's a very good film. You could probably get it from any library, maybe streaming services too, for a couple dollars. It's called Boy A, Boy, and then letter A. Boy A is a fictional piece, but I've seen it all before. I've seen it in reality because it has, obvious remnants of what really happens in people's lives. Again, what is the purpose of literature? Because sometimes it's a mirror reflection of who we are or what we see. So we have this boy, and as a young child, he commits a horrible crime. When another child, he kills a young boy. And so they wind up going to incarceration because he and his friend killed this other young child. And he goes through incarceration. He goes as a young boy and boy A, and he comes out really like a young man. I assume he in the film he's about 19, 20 years old. Through the film, he talks about and engages in a relationship with a woman that's about his age, 19, 20 years old. They have sexual activity for the first time. He begins to cry. And there's these poignant parts in the film that are showing us that even though he's been through all these horrible dynamics, he's committed murder, he's become incarcerated, removed from his father, removed from society, that there were aspects of his development that he just didn't have the chance to work through. The reaction he has with this relationship, the intensity of his sexual urges, the intensity of his sexual liaison, which we see on film with this young woman, he doesn't even know how to react emotionally. Maybe that was a place he could have found himself 15, 16, 17 years old. Instead, he finds himself in this reaction, in this overwhelmed status, begins to cry. He is splintered. On one hand, he feels like a man. On the other hand, he feels childlike. He has this sort of confusion of emotions all at this one place. I think to myself, if Shakespeare could have, remember, in Shakespeare's time, he really couldn't talk about sexual intercourse, sexual activity directly, etc. Would have been banned. He would have been shunned. What would he do with this today to be able to talk about sex, sexuality, the idea of when childhood ends, when adulthood begins, how to have relationships with parents? Here's another one I would love to have seen what Shakespeare would have done with it, as well as Tennessee Williams. Remember, 1950s, you were branded a communist the minute you started writing outside of the lines, coloring outside of the lines, broaching subjects that were considered private and bedroom subjects. Influence of religion, influence of politics. Just couldn't do that. What would Tennessee have done if he had full-bodied characters that were having sexual intercourse with one another, sexual experience, leaving their parents' clutches to go and form their new identity, who they are, right? How would they have handled that today? I would love to have seen it you know, very important places in people's development, all of these important places. There's another film, I wasn't going to mention it till I'm just here thinking with you, The Prince of Tides, okay? Very important film in the 1980s. I'll tell you why it was important. What would Shakespeare have done with this one, right? It's a film, when you first see Prince of Tides, you say, oh, this is a film about a midlife guy in his 40s that's having a midlife crisis who thinks he wants a divorce, right? We've seen this all before. We know this storyline. We've had parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, people we've worked with, school teachers, we've watched them get divorced. So we know this storyline, nothing new. About third way into Prince of Tides, oh boy, the tide changes. And all of a sudden, the character starts talking about his sexual abuse and his rape by another man. This goes into an exceptional place in the 1980s when we weren't talking about rape as it related to the male. We just didn't. We never really did. And so people didn't know what to do with this film even in the 1980s. People were so shocked. They were so shocked, to discuss that a male would be raped. We saw this in the film Deliverance, another cultural classic, okay? Pop culture classic. We didn't know what to do with it. But we know what to do with it now to acknowledge these kinds of circumstances that happen to persons, regardless of gender, as important benchmarks in their lives that need to have a sense of sympathy, care, sincerity, kindness, understanding, etc. I mention this because what would Shakespeare have done with this idea that men could also be victims, that men weren't always the villain? I think about this. I think about this. It's nothing we hadn't seen before, I'm sorry to say. Well, the whole idea of sexual intrusion, rape, etc., crimes against somebody else's uh, person, that violation. But really, if Shakespeare could have delivered this kind of theme to us, how would he have done it? How would he have brought it to us? How would it have really opened our eyes, not only in gender studies, just in the study of humanity? So I think to myself, this is why literature and its various mechanisms delivered to us is so important, because we can talk about drug use, we can talk about alcohol abuse, we can talk about sexual abuse violation. We can talk about this whole personal emotion of where do our lives start and stop, and where do our parents' lives start and stop as it relates to our oversight, you know? Where do we become our full self-embodiment, get to act out what it is that we wish, free will and everything else. I'll close with this thought. Sometimes I even think to myself included, as a parent, remember I've been both roles, okay? I think to myself as a parent, at what point do we get to the restaurant of life? I say it in metaphor, and somebody says to your child, regardless of their age, what would you like to order? At what point does the parent know not to answer? You see? At what point? At what point does the parent sit with the child in the living room and you talk about politics, and maybe one parent feels strongly about one candidate and the child, who's now an adult, feels strongly, and at what point does the parent have to realize that their influence cannot influence how their child votes? Same with sexuality. At what point does a parent have to look at a situation, and maybe the parent thought that the child was going to be more of a conventional sexual choice. And then all of a sudden the child says, I hate to break this to you, but what you thought and who you thought I was and who I am are two very different people. If you can't accept that, I can't come around anymore. What does a parent do with that? The parent has to come to terms with who their child is as an adult. At what point does the parent do that? Again, I used examples, the driver's license, the ability to vote, the ability for child to rent an apartment at 18 years old, to make a legal contract for themselves, to go off to war, right? To do all of these things. Or even the child that sits in college, that the child says, I chose 5 classes for this semester, and this is what I'm going to be taking. At what point does the parent have to say, that sounds wonderful, good luck to you, let me know how it goes, how exciting, rather than saying, well, if I'm paying for it, you'll take what I want you to take. Ouch. So many of my peers, and I've tried not to make these mistakes, I hope I didn't, but so many of my peers will say, well, I'm not paying for my child to go to college to take a particular set of courses. I'm not paying for that. Well, at what point does the child's life become individual from the parent's wallet? I don't know, you know? So I think about this. How would Shakespeare have handled these contemporary scenarios, right? At what point these sociological emotional struggles, I think that they are timeless classics, because every generation goes through this pulling and tugging. Anyhow, you need to get on with your lives. I've taken up enough of your time with this subject, but I'm going to leave you with those thoughts. I enjoy our time together in the chats, etc. If you need to access me on campus, or you want to meet or talk about, any of the material, I'm around all day, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Certainly, I'm easy to find. I'm hiding out in plain sight. I wish you well always, that you find some joy in your day, some peace, and for you to always be well. Blessings to you. Bye-bye.